a while back you had mentioned that taking action, taking a decision, or initiating an action, rather than using thinking to guide it or relying on emotions, to seek a deeper place from which the action can follow from. I'm not expressing it very clearly as you had mentioned previously, but the point is...
Yeah, I don't remember saying that exactly.
Yeah, that's not what you said, but basically to not rely on the brain, the mind to decide on an outcome or on how to act, and also not get swayed by emotions, but to seek a deeper origin. And you used the word beautiful to describe the best course of action, right? So if what we if how we act is not, if we are not in control of that, or at least the self is not in control, then the question of the beautiful thing to do at any given moment simply becomes one of what is the course of action that is more acceptable to that the mind can accept, so that it can go to presence practice more. But somehow this doesn't seem satisfying explanation. Where is the...
So the mind can't go to presence practice. I mean, the mind can think, I'd like to go to presence practice, and can make some kind of preparation for it. But the letting go of the mind is presence practice happening. So I mean, of course it gets tricky to talk about how we make decisions when we're starting to realize that the self-idea is not in control, and choice is, in the deepest sense, an illusion. Because it's still the mind that's trying to choose how to deal with that situation. It doesn't work. So all we do is come up against this realization. All we do is carefully observe simplify ourselves, meaning let go of our beliefs, our ideologies, the knots of thinking we get caught in. And even when we say don't be swayed by emotions, it's not, the energy of emotion is no problem. So it's the story that is usually attached to the energy that's the problem. And that story is actually thinking. So it's not really pure emotion. It's some idea. Like we feel the energy of anger, let's say, but then we have the story, this person did wrong to me. It's the story we have to let go of. The energy is fine. It's just energy. So the more we practice letting go of our ideas, letting go of believing in thinking, letting go of having the belief that our thinking is accurate or true, or is going to lead us to happiness, is going to lead us to freedom. As we let go of that, we notice activity just happens. And if we don't separate an imaginary person, an imaginary character from the activity happening, and if we don't separate what's happening now with the future result that we're going for, we notice that we can fully enjoy aliveness. We can call that state of just appreciation, beauty or love or whatever. When the thinking that separates things ceases. And there's not technically something you can do from the willful thinking mind to make that happen. You just observe and notice that phenomena, and you're drawn to it, or you're not. With most of our decisions, some thinking is involved, but as you believe less and less in the validity of the thinking, I mean, thinking is perfectly valid in accomplishing practical tasks. But as you let go of the reliance on the thinking to bring you happiness, you notice the thinking is extra. It might go along with your decisions, but it actually is not necessary for the decisions. Maybe for the decisions, because that's kind of a thinking thing. But for the activity of the body-mind, it's not necessary. I mean, it usually arises, but it doesn't have to. And it usually clouds the appreciation of the moment. And it's not so much that you don't make effort. Effort continues to happen. What's important is to see that there's no person making the effort. That's another way of saying thinking's not in control. So the person is thinking. And as long as the person's there, there's some separation between the person and the outside world, between the person and the other, between the past and the future actions. But when you relinquish that person and just activity is happening, just liveliness is happening, then there's no separation. And activity happens in harmony. Not because objectively something's different, just because the nature of reality is harmony, and your thinking, which makes disharmony appear, ceases. So practically speaking, all there is to do is as a practitioner of presence is just letting go. You can't fabricate your next step. Sometimes, as I mentioned before, sometimes you can repeat certain words that you've noticed have an effect on you. Like awareness itself is happiness, or right now, who is the doer, or something like that. So if that comes up and you say those things to yourself and it has an effect, then that's fine. But the more you attach to that being a mechanism that's going to do something, the more problem you're going to have. Because the person doing it is actually that person still holding the self and still wanting an effect and still thinking in terms of past and future.
So it seems to me whether the action comes from or appears to come from ideology or karma based, or whether the action is driven by something deeper, it really doesn't matter. What matters is whether one is able to drop it and return to present. So there's nothing magical about an activity that is driven from a deeper source.
It's always driven by the deepest source. That's the thing. It's always driven by the deepest source. So if you really could change what it's driven by, it would matter, but you can't, actually. It's simply a question of whether it's being driven by the deepest source, the universe, and it has a bunch of self-centered thinking and division and suffering in it, or whether it doesn't have that. And you can't really control whether it does or doesn't, but you can notice. And when you notice, you drop thinking. It happens. I mean, it appears that we can control things. So I'm not saying that the appearance is not there, but it's just an appearance. Whatever we're thinking, whether self-centered ideas come up or not, is the universe happening, regardless. But when you see that, you let go of self-centered thinking. When you realize you're the universe regardless, then what's the point of lifting up then when you lift up at a habit, you lift up the self-idea, you realize this is just causing suffering. It has no point, right? Normally we think it has a lot of point. We're going to control our life, and it's that self-idea that it's all about, and we're very attached to it. As we notice through practice, that's just a burden. We start to let go and see what happens, and we don't just fall down as a blob and lie there, for some reason. We keep getting food and eating and walking around and doing things. And we realize the less we have agenda, the more free we are, that's all. But it's always coming from that deep place. So the self-idea thinks, now my action is coming from this place, now it's coming from this place, now it's someone else's fault, now it's my fault. But there isn't someone else's fault and there isn't my fault. Practically speaking, that could be fine to say this person did this and I need to let them know to not do that because it's causing suffering. There's no problem. But ultimately, that person is the universe happening and you are the universe happening, and it's not different. When we're living from that place, it's such a relief. You don't have to keep score anymore. We're constantly keeping score of ourselves mostly, but also, or frequently also, of other people, right? And we're doing better than the other person, or doing worse than the other person or people. We're trying to remember who to blame and who's responsible, to relieve us of blame, or if we're in the mode of self-blame, we're just, I'm so bad, and it's all just meaningless habit. So just seeing the arrogance of thinking that our analysis is correct is such a relief. It's never correct. Not because there's something wrong with us, but because analysis is incorrect inherently about reality. Analysis is just analysis. It's just thinking. Again, your analysis of a practical situation or how to get somewhere or how to fix a piece of machinery might be correct or incorrect and might have good use, but to understand reality, it's useless. And to bring relief and happiness, it's useless, ultimately. Again, we're tricked into thinking that our control does bring some kind of happiness because we go after some goal and sometimes we get the goal and then at that time we feel some relief. But if we give it close attention, the relief is because now we don't have that thing we have to do. We've unburdened ourselves with that future thing we have to do. But we can just do that without changing the outer circumstance. Whether that practical goal is accomplished or not is actually irrelevant to our freedom, to our relief, to our joy. Just awareness itself, liveliness itself is joy. So normally we relegate these tiny places where we allow ourselves just to enjoy liveliness, aliveness. When we've accomplished something, when we've taken care of what we think we have to take care of. Then for a brief moment we allow ourselves to just be alive and it feels so good. And then we're confused and think it's because we accomplished that thing. Every second, every time, every place, because there's no time and place in joy, actually. We're always, the ground of joy is there. It's just whether you have a veil in front of it, of the self, of the thinking. And thinking itself also isn't really a veil for you. It really doesn't really stop joy. It's when you believe in that. It's when that attachment happens. When you think your thinking is accurate to the reality and you need it to determine how you're going to be happy, how you're going to be successful. That reliance has an anxiety in it that separates you from appreciating the moment. So it's really the degree that you're invested in believing your thinking is the degree that your appreciation is dulled of presence. that helpful?
Yes, very.
One way to look at that question of where your decisions are coming from is that it's just our thinking that thinks it's coming from somewhere. There's nowhere else. It's coming from here. I mean, we have memory that says karma and cause and effect and because of this thing, and that's how it appears. But as soon as you let go, it's coming from here. Just like everything else, just like the sunlight and the trees and your breath, everything. So trying to figure out where it's coming from is, well, one of my teachers used to call looking off. You always can start fresh right now to be most intimate. That's not to say it isn't sometimes useful to look back in your memory and say, oh, I have this pattern is happening again now. I'd like to change that pattern. That's all okay, but to the degree that we believe our analysis is going to be the degree that we're not totally fresh in appreciating the moment. So if we're spending a little time noticing a habit pattern and registering that we want to let go of that habit pattern, that's fine. And then we can drop back into presence. So we certainly have the appearance, the experience of free will. I mean, we can look at what free will really means. I don't think it's actually as clear as it seems, but we all think that there's a person in our bodies, behind our eyes, that's somehow making choices. It's not really clear where the choice comes from, but somehow we feel like there's a person that's in control. And I am saying that's a complete illusion. It's not real. So we never actually have free will because there isn't a person that can have free will. There isn't a person from whom those decisions come from. So the essential illusion is that there's this particular separate person here that's different from these people and different from my surroundings. And it's inside the body and outside there's that. So this is very radical and challenging stuff. So obviously this contradicts our basic conditioning that we've all had since being children, and we still operate with, no matter how familiar we are with this new perspective. But there can be a big shift in our awareness depending on how much we believe that to be actually true or just habitual conditioning happening. Again, not any one's habitual conditioning. The universe's habitual conditioning happening in this body-mind. So, the fact that we feel like we're having choice is natural and happens and will, as far as we can tell, will continue to happen for all these practical decisions. At the same time, we as body minds can have an awareness evolve or emerge suddenly that's just an apparent phenomena. It's not actually how it is. That all the decisions we're making is the universe happening through this body-mind. And there's no person that we think that's generating the choices. We can look at it through time in a more conventional perspective, a kind of a scientific perspective. So we can believe that there's outer reality and material and all that if you want. When you follow this, a non-dual perspective, usually that's all questioned and let go of. But even if we hold on to that conventional worldview that there's material, when you look at the conventional worldview, it doesn't make any sense actually, because when you break it down to atoms, eventually you get nothing. So, but anyway, we believe that generally, and you can have that, and also you can have past and future believing they're true, and you can still see that causes and conditions through past and future generate our choices. I mean, there's no real explanation for spontaneously choices coming about in that mind view of there being a self and being past and future. Everything's conditioned, even a little choice, what food you reach to grab for, or a big choice, what direction you want to pursue in your life or whatever. It's all causes and conditions. That's kind of the mechanistic, scientific materialist perspective. And from that perspective, you can still say choice is an illusion. It's an illusion in the brain of neurons, and we have this thing. I'm not saying that's an accurate model, but that's our conventional model. And even looking through that conventional model, choice becomes an illusion. The more usual non-dual model is that there's just awareness, there's just consciousness, and past and future are illusions, actually, that happen in consciousness, which is always presence. And in that model, there's no self because there's just consciousness. In consciousness, the idea of a self emerges and at some point dissipates. Actually, many times, all the time, it emerges and dissipates during our life. So in that model, also there's no choice because there's no individual to make a choice. There's just consciousness happening. You can say consciousness or God or whatever word is completely free because there's no constraint. But there's no individual making separate choices apart from the whole. So we talked about this last week, that one way you can look at it is this idea of free will. This is a quote from Krishnamurti, that it's a contradiction in terms, because will is never free, will is conditioned. So the idea that you're making a will, you're making choices, is kind of the materialist view, and it's just coming from causes and conditions. So will can't be free. But there is freedom. But freedom is not something that your conditioned thinking mind can grasp. But we're so attached to our thinking mind as being me that we want that to be free. We all want freedom. That's a natural draw because we are freedom. But because we're confused and think we're this thinking person, that this character that we've imagined ourselves to be, we want that character to be free, but that character can't be free. Because that character is a story dependent on past and future, dependent on causes and conditions. When that character ceases, there's just awareness. Awareness is free, but it's not making particular choices. Because that's all in past and future. That's all in the story. So you either have freedom, which is outside of the story completely, which you can't really say anything about, and I'm just talking about it now, but I'm just hinting at it. I can't encapsulate it in words. Or there's a story that's not free. So if you're thinking about your life as a trajectory, and you're thinking about yourself as separate from other beings, it's not really free. There's an illusion that it's free. But if that all drops away, there is freedom. That's in fact what your nature is. But it has no story, and it has no past and future. And it has no separation, and it includes everything. And that's what we actually really want as I'm proposing. That's what our heart is actually longing for when we want freedom. When we want to feel that we're free and we're not conditioned and we're not machines. We're not. But in the story mind of past and future and separate being and material, we are, if you follow that through. So the route to freedom is we have to let go of the story, otherwise it's a contradiction. We're trying to keep the story and freedom, which doesn't fit with the story. But when we let go of the story, there is freedom. Does that make any sense? It's the best I can do at the moment.
I mean, it does.
Yeah.
But you're not saying to not make choices and not act because ultimately I don't have free will, so therefore I'm just going to walk around and let things happen.
I'm saying that that's the case anyway. So to say that I shouldn't make a choice is just a choice. So you can think that that's the problem that I was referring to before. We can think that the thinking mind is going to go toward freedom from thinking mind, but it can't, actually. So whether you choose to make a choice or you choose to try to not make a choice, it's still the illusion of choosing one or another. Reality is the universe is happening without choice, and within that is the illusion of choices being made. So if you want to experiment trying not to make any, or not be conscious of making any choices, or what will really happen is you notice choices automatically coming and then you stop doing them or you stop following them. If you want to practice that could be really interesting. So I'm not saying don't do that. I'm also not saying do that particularly. I mean, you can't get away from reality. Seeing that brings relief. That's all I'm saying. I mean, for most of us, we're going to keep feeling like we make choices sometimes. But to the degree that we believe it in a deeper sense, and the degree that we attach to this separate self that makes choices, is the degree that we suffer, actually. And the degree that we let that go is we feel freedom. If someone can just be happening without any experience of choice, they're probably going to feel very free. But it doesn't seem to be the human condition. But it does seem to be part of a potential of the human condition to start letting go of really believing that. And that's, generally called awakening. Really believing that there's a separate self. But the appearance of a separate self doesn't cease. As far as I know, hasn't for me, hasn't for anyone I've met. But the belief that it's really real does change, and that actually alters how you experience life. Like if you really believe you're making a choice, you'll really worry about a choice. And then if you really believe you've made the wrong choice, you'll really feel bad about yourself. And if you think someone else has made a bad choice, you'll really blame them. All that stuff is heavy and hurtful. If you don't really believe it, the appearance of choice still appears, but you see through it pretty quickly, and you can't really blame other people, and you can't really blame yourself. And shame and jealousy and hatred and longing and all those things just don't have a place to root anymore. And ultimately, the sense of being separate doesn't have a place to root anymore. Because you realize every phenomena is just consciousness happening. The tree is just as much me as something that comes out of my mouth. And it's actually more fun to just notice things coming out of your mouth than to think, I said it and I'm so good, And you notice, oh, that's actually a weight. Or I said it and I'm so bad. That's actually a weight. And it's not true. It just happened. It's true that we have that thought. I'm not saying everything we experience is true as an experience. It just doesn't have anything behind it. And so that brings relief. So it's very scary to really contemplate that there's no free will, because the self is made up of that illusion that we're making free choices. As a separate being, I'm making separate free choices. So it's like telling someone they're not real. But when we observe our life carefully, we can see that self-idea it's not what we need to feel happiness. It's actually what gets in the way of happiness. Happiness is what happens when reality is just let to be reality without that self idea. But this is it's very revolutionary to our, conventional mind, of course. Although the evidence is so overwhelming constantly, it's like if you ask anyone what's the most beautiful, happy, joyful time in their life, they'll almost always say something where they weren't thinking at all of themselves. It's like the evidence is so obvious, but we still think the self is going to get it. Even when we come to spiritual practice, we think the self is going to engineer my spiritual practice and get to enlightenment. But enlightenment or awakening is the self giving up. That's all it is.
On the way here, I was on 13th downtown, and I saw these two women at a table, and they were just talking about their past jobs, and I think that's a good example. If they would have just sat there and just been like, wow, it's such a gorgeous day, and just looked at each other, that would have been so much more fulfilling than delving into their previous work history. And I think I don't know if that's a simple way of kind of explaining what you're talking about, or if that's too simplified, but...
I mean, yeah. It's just sometimes we talk about things and that's okay. It's how much you believe in it. Yeah, I mean.
Right.
Yeah, anything. Any abstract idea based on the self that we really believe in is keeping us away from the appreciation of our life. Sometimes one kind of illusory distraction is less painful than another kind of illusory distraction. And so we can say it might be okay to indulge in something that's actually keeping you from total appreciation, but it's distracting you from something more painful. That might be okay temporarily. I mean, ultimately we want to face what causes us pain so we can see it's an illusion and let go. If we don't face it, then we keep thinking it's real and it keeps chasing us. But if you're obsessing about something that's really painful and then you go watch a movie and your mind is off of it and you're still in some kind of illusion of the movie, believing in selves and whatever, but it's much lighter than the obsession before, that might be healthy temporarily, right? So that might be okay. But as soon as we recognize that there's a potential to just be totally present and let go of everything, of course we do that. But it's very tricky because the self is always looking for, the habit of the self is always looking for, because there is no self, right? But the habit, the appearance of the self is always looking for some way to continue itself. So it can use spirituality too. And you can get mad at yourself for believing in your thoughts. I've believed in my thoughts for the last 10 minutes. I'm such a bad practitioner. That's just another identity that you're grasping on. So the way to navigate spiritual practice is never to beat yourself up, or have great aspirations for what you're going to do. It's just drop into it. There's nothing else you can do but drop into it. But also the self can set things up that help it drop into things. I mean, it appears to be that way, right? So that's okay. If you're finding you're not dropping into it, but you're finding you are able to say, I'm going to sit in meditation for 5 minutes, and then when you do that, you do drop into it, go ahead and do that. That sounds good. But of course, you don't need to sit down to drop into presence. I was about to say emptiness, which is another word for it. You can just do it. But sometimes you can't. You don't just do it, so, it's like shifting from this sense of I'm going to control it to I'm just watching what comes up. And the learning happens naturally that way. And I'm just watching that happen. Ironically, it often, big experience of clarity often happen after big effort. But it doesn't mean you should or shouldn't make a big effort. It's just, that's how it happens. You're drawn to make a big effort, and then there's a big release. It's like when you're tired of a repetitive, habitual self, there's another part of the self that just wants to do something to break out of it. So you do some crazy retreat or some strenuous effort. And that's still led by the self. So that itself isn't released. But pushing yourself into a new place can engender all of a sudden just letting go. Just nothing makes sense anymore. And you let go of everything. And then everything makes perfect sense. Not sense, thinking sense, but everything is just harmony. So you can't make an ideology out of, I'm not going to make an effort, because there's no effort necessary. Because that's just another self-idea. Right? You can't say whether there's effort or no effort. All you can do is just really and honestly observe what's happening. There's total honesty about what you're experiencing and the suffering that comes up. And total willingness to let go when you see that there's suffering connected to what you're holding. So if you're drawn to do some kind of hardcore practice, you should do hardcore practice. If you're not drawn to it, you're not going to do it, so it doesn't matter. You're not going to do it sincerely. But always checking in with whether you have some big illusion about something. When I finish this hardcore practice, I'm going to get enlightened. That's not helpful. Right? I'm just drawn to this practice for some reason. So I think it's healthy when people ask why you're doing something if you don't know. Because the universe can't be asked why questions. Because the universe is not in time. And why is a human thinking question, first of all, and it's also a time, cause and effect question. And the universe doesn't work that way, and so you as the universe don't work that way really either. So when you don't know, the filters are dropping. Yeah.
Are you saying universe as awareness? Or universe
Yep.
Okay, just curious if there's another way to see it where there is only awareness and the universe arises in awareness.
So I was using universe as very general, so not the material universe. That arises in awareness. I was using it in a ultimate sense where it's synonymous with awareness.